You're tuned in to Health Professional Radio. I'm Henry Acosta, the host for this segment. Our guest today is Dr. Alan Barclay. He is an accredited dietitian and nutritionist. He has over 21 years of experience in that field and has appeared in numerous articles and features on newspapers, magazines, radio shows, and TV. He's with us today to talk about the new health trend, or it's not really new, but the health trend that you might have heard of. It's called the Ketogenic Diet. With all that said, welcome to the show, Dr. Alan. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me.
And well, just to kick things off, can you tell us what is the ketogenic diet?
Well, there are various versions of it, but the most popular one is where you consume around about 80% of your daily energy from fat, and you restrict your carbohydrate intake to less than 10% of energy from carbohydrates, of course. So it's a very high-fat, very low carbohydrate diet, 10% of energy from carbohydrates, around about 50 grams for an average adult, which, of course, is, for example, 2 slices of bread and a piece of fruit for the entire day, so not very much at all. And in theory, it forces your body to use fat as a fuel by converting fatty acids from fats, either from the diet or stored fat in fat tissues, into ketones, which can be used as a fuel by various organs in the body, including the brain, though there is still, of course, a minimum requirement, and that's why that 10% of energy from carbohydrate is there, because some organs and tissues do have to have glucose for fuel.
Yeah, and what does a usual meal look like for people who are on the ketogenic diet?
Fairly heavy on meat, seafood, or poultry, depending on your preference, or eggs or cheese, and then lots of fats and oils, so butter, cream, or margarines if you prefer, and various oils, whatever the type you prefer. Not very much vegetables, so there are a few obviously low carbohydrate vegetables like your greens, including lettuce, onions, and other savoury things like garlic, peppers, capsicums, whatever. And the only fruit that's considered to be low enough in carbohydrate, of course, is the berry, so strawberries and other berries. So it's fairly meat and fat heavy, not for everybody. You're avoiding, of course, most fruits, most starchy vegetables, your cereal-based foods, so breads, pastas, rice, and other foods based on those cereals, like breakfast cereals and the like, and legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas, and even milk and yogurt if you want to take it to its extreme, of course, because they contain lactose. So, and as I said before, so you are allowed up to 50 grams a day for an adult, so it could be 2 pieces of bread and a piece of fruit as an example that would make up that 50 grams. So very low in carb indeed.
Well, why do you think it's been so popular, it's getting popular again nowadays? Since
well, that's right, and it's not the first time. It's been around probably for about 100 odd years now, depending on when you start counting from, and it's gone through various degrees of popularity. Initially, due to its effect on epilepsy, which came back into research status, if you like, in the late 90s in children, and it does certainly reduce the incidence of fits in children with epilepsy. But again, it's a very extreme diet, and obviously there's issues for children with respect to growth. And I should have mentioned perhaps earlier that there's not enough vitamins and minerals and dietary fibre in it, so you need to take some sort of a supplement in order to make it nutritionally complete. There's also been some growing interest with respect to cancer cells, because we know that cancer cells are particularly dependent on glucose for fuel, and there have been some suggestion that having a very low carb diet and a ketogenic diet may help with the management of certain kinds of cancer. But lastly, of course, with respect to weight, which is unfortunately very cyclical, and we've been through the low-carb phase, if you like, was last popular in the 70s. Then it went out of fashion in the 80s and 90s, but came back in fashion in the late 90s when Atkins launched his new diet revolution, and, of course, has been in fashion again since then. So I think this is just an extension of that very low-carb diet fashion statement. And, whether you replace it with protein or fat, obviously, because there are only really three macronutrients, though one should not ignore alcohol. So in theory, of course, proteins and their compositional molecules, the amino acids, some of those amino acids can be converted to glucose. So generally speaking, the ketogenic diet doesn't contain a lot of carbohydrate or protein to prevent that protein from being converted into glucose. So that's why it's so high in fat. So really it's just manipulating the macronutrients. And unfortunately, food is fashion, and it's back in fashion.
Oh, okay. So, that's an interesting take with the subject. And I didn't expect that kind of answer, since usually when people go on keto, they're actually crazy about it.
Yeah, well, I think, we seem to be developing into tribes, if you like, and yes, the fanatical tribe, certainly, I think there are groups of people out there that are amongst that. But, you have to be a special kind of person to be that adherent to it. And what the studies have shown, for example, in the area of cancer, where there's a very strong motivation to adhere to a diet, I might add, only about a third of those people can adhere to those diets for the duration of the study, which shows that most people, 2/3 of people, really can't adhere to these diets. And when you look at it in children, in the epileptic studies, again, children, I guess, probably being fussier eaters than adults, they find it exceptionally difficult to adhere to these. So it does take a special kind of person to dedicate their life to this way of eating. I guess if your family and close friends are following it, then that makes it a little bit easier. But from a broader cultural perspective, obviously it has severe limitations with respect to life social activities where food plays a central part. And I think that's the biggest problem with any fad diet, is adhering to it in the long term. And, we must keep in mind that really there are no long-term studies of the ketogenic diet. So 2 years is about the maximum duration that I've been able to find. And I suspect that most people can't adhere to it beyond that time frame unless, you've got exceptional circumstances.
For, let's say you're talking to a person who's interested in going into keto or doing the ketogenic diet, when would you ever recommend them to do it?
Well, I think it can be justified in children with severe frequent epilepsy who have tried everything else and who aren't responding to medication. So it may be worth trialling it under that circumstance, and certainly, that is something that's available in Australia. But again, it needs to be under medical supervision, and dietary adequacy is the biggest issue, obviously, with children who are still growing, and making sure that they get enough vitamins and minerals and enough energy overall, because in general it's not a very palatable diet, so getting enough calories, believe it or not, seems to be a bit of an issue. So, that's one good example where I think it's justified. As far as for adults, it will achieve weight reduction, although there appears to be some statistically significant advantages over a low-fat diet, for example. There's question as to whether it's clinically significant. And I think it's just one of those typical examples where, there are many ways to lose weight, and this is one of them. It's not for everybody. Many people will struggle, I think, with the palatability side of it, and I think it's socially disruptive. I would suspect it's a short-term solution to a long-term problem like most fad diets are. So, I generally would find it hard to recommend to an average adult wanting to lose a moderate amount of weight, but maybe somebody with severe obesity who has tried many other different diets may wish to try it under appropriate medical and dietetic supervision to make sure that their nutritional status isn't compromised overall.
For regular people who are listening right now, since mostly are health professionals, what would be the best recommended diet for everyone, or for the general population?
Well, I think as most people know, the best diet's the one you can stick to, particularly when it comes to weight reduction, because, it does, for most people, need to be the long term, and the whole yo-yo dieting principle going on a cycle of diets, losing weight and regaining it obviously is not a long-term solution. So choosing an eating pattern that fits within your cultural, religious and social background, where you can obviously minimize the amounts in kilojoules of food and drink that you consume, is going to be the best long-term solution. And obviously, depending on whether you've got other comorbidities, whether it's diabetes, cardiovascular disease or what have you, obviously tailor-making recommendations to address those underlying risk factors is important as well. But really modifying people's existing diets by making swaps. I think the swap it, don't stop it approach is arguably the best from a behavioural perspective within the framework of an individual's existing diet. And of course, that's exactly what dietitians do. When people see a dietitian, we go through in great detail what people are currently eating and drinking, and then make suggestions to either decrease the intake of certain foods or drinks, or to change the quality to improve, obviously, the overall quality of the diet and the eating pattern. That's what's involved in long-term healthy eating, rather than going on a diet as such.
Yeah, that's actually really great advice for all our listeners, the thinking about the long-term rather than having short-term, I guess, diets or fads.
Yeah. Anybody can go on a diet, but you can't stick to it.
Yeah, and with regards to diets and nutrition, what would be the biggest misconception that you always get?
Well, I think, I've alluded to it already, food and nutrition tends to be fat as we go through phases. And part and parcel of that paradigm is singling out single nutrients or ingredients or food groups, and then trying to lay the blame solely for all people on that particular nutrient, ingredient, food group, and eliminating it or demonizing it. I think we should avoid that folly. We have done it to some extent with respect to fats, and I think we forget that dietary guidelines, which have been around since the early 1980s in this country, always have recommended a balanced diet and not focused particularly on any particular nutrient, but individuals, and I blame the low-fat fad in this and other parts of the world on Nathan Pritikin, and even an airline pilot called Ross Vaughan in this country who popularised it. It's those individuals that single out nutrients and then basically get almost religious zeal in removing them from the diet, creates a sort of environment that unfortunately food industry follows it, because I guess it has no choice. They do market research projects all the time and see what people are looking for, design foods that are, for example, low in fat, but they may not be healthier choices overall. They've just removed a particular nutrient or ingredient, and we've done it again, I think, from the late 90s, early 90s with respect to carbohydrate. And there were a whole range of low-carb foods when Atkins' diet came out again that arguably were no better nutritionally, but they were just pandering, if you like, to the latest fad. So we're doing it again here with carbohydrates in general, and I think we should learn from the past, not make that same mistake. There are many ways of eating well. All of the nutrients in food are essential one way or the other, and also enjoyable. And it's all about balance. Dose makes the poison. As long as we don't go extreme with any particular nutrient or ingredient or food group, then we can consume them quite happily and enjoy them, rather than demonize and eliminate. So I think it's that whole negative approach that we've got. There's too much stick and not enough carrot. And, food isn't the enemy. So I think we need to stop blaming it, make peace with foods, and enjoy the traditional cuisines that humankind have come up with over the past few millennia for what they are, and enjoy them in moderation.
Yeah, that's a great message, and thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and for our last question, what would be the best way to get in touch with you for all the people who would like to inquire about diets and maybe even get a checkup?
Well, I have a clinic which I run in Sydney on a Saturday, so you can see me personally there in Beverly Hills in Sydney. I don't know how much detail I'm able to give, but I'm sure you can find me if you Google me. And otherwise, I do actually do a monthly blog as well, which we call GI News. But despite the name, it's really just about healthy eating, and that's a Google blog. So for the latest tips and advice, you can certainly read up on that as well.
All right, sounds great. And thank you so much for getting on the show, Doctor. It was great having you on.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and that was Dr. Alan Barclay, and we just finished talking about the ketogenic diet and the current trends that's going around the fitness industry. If you've liked this interview and you're interested in the current trends around the health industry, you can find more at www.hpr.fm. We're also available for streaming and download on YouTube, SoundCloud, and iTunes. To keep up with all our content and updates, you can find our social media pages on our website. I'm Henry Acosta, and this is Health Professional Radio.